often asked how I started in beer, what got me into beer. And I was visiting my brother Richard Forsley down in Pensacola, Florida with my friend Gordon Hirchebys, and my brother loved this place called McGuire's, and they had just opened up a brewery. They had McGuire's Irish Pub and Brewery. We walked in and the place was really excited about the new beers that they were brewing. And I went over and met the brewmaster, saw the brewery, and I said to Gordon and my brother, geez, this would work, in Maine. Well, when I got back to Maine, it was Gritty McDuff's. I met Richard Pfeffer and Eddie Stebbins, who owned Gritty's, and I, as a real estate guy, showed them Kennebunk and signed a letter of intent. Long story short, they decided not to do it, and they introduced me to Alan Pugsley during this process. And Alan, at that point, had already set up a number of breweries in North America. They called him the Johnny Appleseed of brewing. Anyways, long story short, they told me they didn't want to do it, and there was a tenant there that had a little lobster business, and I convinced them that we ought to do it. I raised the money, and just before we opened, they decided they didn't want to do it. All of a sudden, I'm stuck having raised $300,000 to start a brewery in Kennebunk, KBC, Kennebunk Port Brewing Company. We're going into June. We were supposed to open a week earlier, and I said to Alan, can you be involved in this and keep us brewing? And he had already hired a brewer. We had already hired a brewer, Jack Strike. And long story short, next thing you know, I'm opening and closing one side of what is now Federal Jack's, and we called it the upper deck. And I was dealing with running the brewery and running a brew pub. That fall, when it got slow, I started delivering beer in my S10 Blazer. So it was June 15th, 1992, we hoisted our first Shipyard Export Ale. So next thing you know, I go from being a real estate guy to being a beer guy. You have to think back. A lot of people, when they ask a question like, how'd you get into it? They think, well, there was actually nobody really doing breweries. They were just started. I mean, Sam Adams was just getting into business, and you had a big home brewing contingency. So I tried to lease the space to other people, but I couldn't get anybody to go into 8 Western Ave. Was on the wrong side of the river. They have the area where George Bush and Barbara used to do the parade every year, and kind of the center of town. And back in the late 80s and 90s, that was where all the action was. Where I was, Kennebunkport, there wasn't much activity, so I couldn't get a tenant. So next thing you know, I'm helping to start a business, and next thing you know, I'm running a business, which was the brewery. Meeting Alan Pugsley, who was a master brewer and had already spent a number of years brewing, was truly the key to my success. I was not a brewer. I was much better a sales guy and much better creative guy and business guy in the sense of dealing with banks and that type of thing. But Alan and I think became partners pretty quickly. It took us about 6 months on a handshake. He became a partner, and that was one of the key things I think that helped make Shipyard a success, and his ability to brew world-class beer and be creative. And back then, most breweries only had 1 or 2 beers, and so that was the key. But he was an expert at training brewers, and a good 30-40% of the brewers in New England, we had a hand in training. Either they came and brewed for us, or they came to brew school, or one of those. So Alan was a big key, and then I think my relationship with Gordon Hirchebys and others that I had as mentors were a big part of success. I don't think personally Fred Forsley could have done it without Alan Pugsley. He had already put in a number of breweries in North America, and nobody else had made him a partner on it, and with sweat equity and a handshake. So I was lucky to be able to do that. So it was the yin and the yang of it. There weren't a lot of people that really would have jumped on board at that particular time that have had the ability. There are a lot of breweries that came and went, but I think Alan's ability to brew world-class beer consistently was definitely a key to our success, and our relationship and our partnership, I think, truly was special. I tell people, if they want to open a brewery, if they want to open a brew pub, have you worked in a brewery? Have you experienced it? Have you really understood what it's going to take? My advice for someone that is going to open a brewery or wants to open a brew pub is really think about where you want to do that, and is there a need for another brewery in that area. First thing I learned in real estate was location, location, location. I think it's the same thing in things like beer. What people think is there's a lot of money in it. And there definitely is not the profit margins that, say were when the beer barons were in it. Today it's one of the most heavily taxed things, so I would say you really have to understand how much tax is involved in beer, and then two, you really got to understand how that beer gets old. It's 30, 60, 90 days before beer starts to really, you want to drunk in those first 120 days. We've gotten a lot better at preserving beer, but the reality is it's like food. And so when people ask me, what is it, give me some info on the beer business, I'd like to say, if before you get in it, really understand, you better have a passion for it. You better love the craft of brewing. And I would say go work in a brewery for a month or two before you jump into it.